Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to join you. I don't know if I can introduce myself any more than how Ms. Carisco just did, but I'm Davante Lewis, and I'm proud to serve on the Louisiana Public Service Commission. And when you think about public service commissioners or public utility commissioners, this past week's weather events remind you the importance of utilities. When we think about what is happening in our nation, we can talk about the greatest last Category 5 and 4 storm since 2017, as you can see on this slide, has all been within our region. And we know that our storms are getting stronger, your electric bills are getting higher, but the power grid at the exact same time is getting weaker, which is creating a system that deserves to be answered. Now, when it comes to climate change policy, normally these have not been at the federal level. I mean, I think the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has showcased that Congress is taking a look, but primarily the job of climate has been left at a very obscure commission known as Public Service or Public Utilities. We are normally 3 to 5 member boards that most people don't know about until a storm happens. Now, Louisiana is one of the most interesting states, I would say, because we are one of 10 states that actually elect their commissions. The vast majority of other states are appointed by their legislature or their governor. And so that gives the residents of Louisiana significant power. Now, a study was just shown that looked at 800 commissioners over the last 20 years, and they looked at their background. So 42% of commissioners come from a background of utility regulation. 33% of commissioners come from a background of previous elected office. 30% of them were either a gubernatorial or staff appointee. About 25% of commissioners across the country worked either in the utility or fossil fuel industry. 19% of commissioners come from the environmental field, and then there was only 10% of commissioners who didn't match any of those categories, and I am one of those 10%. So you're probably asking how a public advocate, former public school teacher, 31-year-old decided to go and run to regulate utilities. Well, the answer is simply about the structure of Louisiana. We're a low-income state. Low-income Louisianians face some of the highest energy burdens, meaning the outside proportions of their income goes towards their energy bills, including electricity, natural gas, and other heating fuels than any other place in the United States. And this is a surprising factor because Louisiana has one of the lowest utility rates per kilowatt. When you talk about what it actually costs to produce electricity in Louisiana, it's relatively low. However, our people have some of the highest bills because of poverty. Here in Baton Rouge, the poverty rate is 90% higher than the U.S. average, and our state household energy use ranks 50th in the nation. So when you combine the factors that we talked about of climate change and increasing storms and people's ability to afford, we're finding ourselves that we are in a crucial moment of how do we make energy policy actually work. And so that is why I decided to run. That is my top priority on the Public Service Commission, is to relieve our people of this burden, but also to find a way to make our system stronger and better for us. Now, unlike most other regulators across this country, Louisiana is also unique. We are the only state where the authority and jurisdiction of the Utilities Regulation Commission is granted by the people in the Constitution and not by statute or by the legislature. So our power is solely ours, and we cannot be interfered with from the legislature. Now, we do not regulate utilities that are owned or operated or regulated by political subdivisions. So that's why if you think about Lafayette or Pineville or even the city of New Orleans, which is the only municipality to regulate what we call an investor-owned utility. However, these subdivisions at their own vote may vote to come in to the Public Service Commission. But the vast majority of our utilities in this nation are what we call monopolies. It is one company has full jurisdiction. And in exchange for that territory, they have an obligation and a responsibility to provide service. And this is what we call in the regulatory world the regulatory compact. And I'll read exactly what that compact is. It is that a public utility has the obligation to provide safe and reliable, unduly discriminatory services to all who can pay at the lowest reasonable cost. In return, that utility receives a monopoly franchise and is guaranteed the opportunity to earn a rate of return on the capital that they prudently invested in the utility. Now, the key word in that compact is really opportunity. There are no specific returns for cost. If they are inefficient, if we find them to be imprudent, if they are not entitled to make up any of the revenue that they have lost from their shareholders and earnings. However, we also cannot make up the utility if they over-earn. If a utility makes more than what they should have made, we cannot come back as a regulator in this compact and say, well, now it's time to give a refund to the customers, unless in that rate we specifically state that if they over-earn, they should give us money back. So it really creates what we like to call the balancing act of a regulator, as you see. How do we balance our consumers who want affordable power, but balancing utilities who are making investments and saying, I have a right to a return? Now, this really started about 100 years ago when we were starting to build power, and we saw that generation and creation of power needed significant amount of resources. And the federal government, unlike what they did in the railroads, decided they were not going to apply public funds to building power generation. And so the utilities had to find a way to get investors to say, this is worthy of investing in the capital. But how can you make these significant capital investments without the actual money? Because the money doesn't come until the generation projects are created. And so that created this political regulatory compact as we know it between the financial community and the regulators to ensure that if an investor-owned utility invests in their money, that they have a right to earn on that capital. And so when we think about the four major functions of what we call an investor-owned utility, they are generation, transmission, distribution, and customer service. And this is what we call a vertically integrated utility, where they own every process of how power gets from the creation of a nuclear, coal, or natural gas power plant to turning on the light switches at your home. And so what we've noticed, the way that we've balanced this is we create what is called a rate. And they are only to be prospective. We cannot look retrospective at rate making. So we can only look at what the utility company says. And if we think about it, if you're an investor-owned utility, the only way that you can make money is by investing in more capital, building more generation, building more transmission and distribution lines. Because every other expense of running a utility business is merely passed to the customer dollar for dollar. As you know, when you look on your bill is whatever amount of power you used that individual month. So the money that shareholders make really is from the investments. But while the regulatory compact effectively solved the dilemma of getting utilities to people, it created a fresh problem that we have in America now is how do we get them to stop making significant investments that may be more costly to you and to me to afford our bills. It's also clear that it should be maximizing investments in new facilities are that they may not be in the best interest of the customers and only in the best interest of their shareholders. And so that's the challenge that we now face ourselves within this regulatory compact. But now what we're seeing is because of electrification of our cars and our homes and our cooking appliances, coal plant retirements and resources with limited capacity such as wind and solar becoming increasingly more available, there has to be more resources and adequate distribution to make sure that we have enough power so everyone can continue. And so what we're starting to see now is because of the emerging technologies, there are companies, hundreds and thousands of them, that are operating outside of that regulatory compact. They are lining up to build power plants, especially energy projects powered by wind and solar and hydrogen and battery and small nuclear modules. And so what we're seeing for the first time is what we are now calling a virtual power plant. These are power plants that exist not in the significant way that we think of them, but in a virtual way, where power doesn't have to be distributed in the exact same way. Over the last 10 years, there's been $120 billion in mostly gas-fired generators to ensure resource adequacy, which is to ensure we have enough power to power everyone's home and to keep their cars. And so this is what is leading to the emerging alternative of a VPP, as I said, a virtual power plant. And these are expected to grow over the next 10 years because of the declining cost of electric vehicles and batteries, technology advancements, the IRA's incentives and promotions to electrification and efficiency, and what we have now all heard about is the decarbonization of our system. And so as you see on the screen, a VPP doesn't operate in that same model that I showed you that a vertically integrated utility would operate in. You can now have a multiple things that are powering either your home, yourself, or powering the system itself. And so VPPs can provide the same resource adequacies at significant cost that we would see. So a study by Brattle that I'm going to tell you about showed the cost-benefit ratio that looked at capital expenditures, looked at operation and maintenance, admission standards, and it found that if we were building a 400 megawatt facility, if we did it with a traditional gas generation plant, it would cost us around $43 million. If we did it making that same 400 megawatt facility with batteries, it would cost around $29 million. But if we built that same 400 megawatt facility with a VPP, utilizing alternative resources, it would only cost us $2 million. So we are talking about somewhere to between $15 and $35 billion in savings and capacity investment over the next 10 years if we move to the new growing technology. And what we've seen is that if we move to this, it increases renewables. It has a better integration to reduce load. What we're seeing with VPPs, and I was at a smart home, where if you're not home and too many people are using power, they will shut off your stove. Now, you can turn it back on, but it's now saving the grid so we don't have blackouts, we don't have brownouts, because now the system is controlling itself. And we have faster grid connection because we don't have to worry about building transmission lines or connections to how we get power from a generator back to your home. And so we're seeing that it's increasing customer satisfaction. And we're seeing this model is changing exactly who we are. As most of us right now, we are what we would like to call a passive consumer. We are only consuming the energy that is given to us. But under a VPP or the new model, we can become what is called a prosumer, where we are now utilizing a solar panel on our homes to reduce our energy load, but also put energy on the grid to provide adequate power to everyone. And then we are seeing with the growing technology of electric vehicles, and if you've seen the commercials for the Ford Lightning, where now your car can be a part of the process of generating power. It shows that the model of the regulatory compact is significantly changing. But even as we talk about this challenge, there's another challenge that many people have asked about challenging this regulatory compact, and that is retail choice. Whether or not you, as a consumer, can choose who to purchase your electricity from directly from the energy supplier rather than the monopoly form that we currently exist here in this country today. Now, there are multiple states who have gone to retail choice, and I'll show a map but just so you can kind of see. And some of these are retail only, some of these are industrial. You can go to the next slide. But as you can see, the country is evolving with places that allow you to choose your own utilities. Now, this is a question that the Louisiana Public Service Commission has not addressed for 20 years, but we will be taking a vote in 2024 whether to make that choice, whether you should have it. But there are growing concerns that come with retail choice. There have been higher retail prices. There have been deceptive market pricing. In deregulated states, the investor-owned utilities still sold electricity to certain companies. And that the distribution of these powers in the wholesale market, which is through a third-party administrator, simply remains. So while people claim and clamor for choice, the challenges of choice also produce that your bills may significantly be higher, and that regulation becomes significantly harder, because at that point it is a free market. But it doesn't actually eliminate investor-owned utilities, because they still have a right to compete. And for example, in the state of Texas, the investor-owned utility still manages the distribution and transmission because that infrastructure is too big to fall. Now, I've briefly talked about electricity management, but the Public Service Commission, we actually regulate a lot more things. How we regulate water, wastewater, pipelines, waste haul movers, taxi cabs, non-consensual tow trucks, moving trucks, and everyone's favorite, telecommunication. Now, while we have similar constructions in gas regulation for electric, there is an emerging threat that we don't talk about, especially in water. In the United States, there's only 16,000 electric companies. However, water, we have over 150,000 water facilities. So when we talk about regulating a fragmented system like that, as water is so vital, it is becoming challenging. But in the energy world, two things can be true at the same time, right? Change is slow, but change is also fast. And we are seeing today that the old way of doing the work, both in the operations of utility and, to be frank, in the competency of government entities, is not keeping up with the opportunities and the demands of the business world today. How do we produce power in a way that keeps it affordable, reliable, sustainable, but also resilient? Because as we know, as the storms are changing, it is creating a problem for us. So the bottom line for us is, if we choose to let utilities make or even participate in the decisions that are so fundamental to our lives and to our well-being, that we must take away their bias towards spending and compensation of their investments. We should not just reward a utility company for spending the greatest amount of money that they can justify doing so, but we should reward them for aligning their interests with the rest of ours. So I believe, and I've been called a little bit of a radical commissioner, that it's time to negotiate a new regulatory compact. That we should not compensate utilities on the basis of their investments, but compensate them on the minimization of our energy usage, reducing pollution, reducing our reliance on energy sources that endanger our people and the planet in the ways that they are produced, transported, and used, and that they are investments that brings a resilient system. And so the question really in managing and regulating utilities is, who holds the power? Both literal and figuratively. Is the power invested in investor-owned utilities who have a monopoly, or is the power for our energy future invested in you all's hands to make competitive choices and to be part of a consumer world? And that, I think, is the tension you will see in utility regulations right now. Thank you. I will. I tried to get right on the money. I think I told you that, so I could answer any questions that people may have.
When you talk about a resilient system, I mean, I am very much in favor of us exploring more solar and more wind. As a commission, what role do you play in that, and have y'all had conversations about more solar and more wind? What's going on?
Yeah, so we as the commission are the ones who decide whether or not the investor-owned utilities or even the electric co-ops that we govern to put renewable energy. And so I think what we're seeing right now is solar and wind are more affordable. About 5 years ago, they probably were not as affordable as a natural gas generation plant. But they are becoming increasingly affordable, and because of this threat that I talked about of these companies who are producing solar and wind at their own cost, not a cost to you, it is pushing the utility companies to really aggressively do it. And so at the commission right now, we're debating multiple factors. We're debating what we're calling the renewable generation option, which would allow industrial users, so our big industrial plants, the right to purchase renewable energy at their own cost and then use the excess that they don't use to power our homes and our grid back, which means that takes away that capital investment that we talked about earlier. And so the commission we have an open docket on wind procurement. I think the challenge that we're going to face with offshore wind particularly is how do we build a connection system to get that offshore wind from Port Fourchon back into some type of power plant to then distribute it and transmit it to other people. That's going to be significantly costly right now, and it would probably run somewhere between $142 to $165 per kilowatt. When we're talking about gas and solar, they're lower in 40s and below. And so it is a question about, but how do we do it? And so what we're seeing is some unique partnerships, and that kind of went back to the community model, where organizations like Together Louisiana are creating what we're calling community solar hubs, which are now putting solar panels on churches and community buildings to make a resilient hub that also collects that solar power. But it also goes back to how individual people can then use that solar. So it's requiring us, I think, to go back and look at our net metering policies, which says if you put a solar panel on your house and you produce more energy than you use, then you should get some savings since we are going to benefit from the electric grid. And so I think it is an ongoing conversation. We have multiple dockets, but I will tell you one of the challenges at the commission is we are notoriously slow. And I think that is the challenge that we have, is how can we do our due diligence but also recognize the world is changing and we need it very fast.
Thank you for coming today. Interesting that you came. This morning I got an email from Entergy that I thought was kind of funny. It said on a scale from 1 to 10, would you recommend Entergy to a friend? Which was crazy because there's no other options. But anyway,
Right.
on that note, so you talked about how we have the compact and we have a monopolistic system, but it gets kept in check by the commission. I know you talked a lot about Louisiana being unique. How unique is that?
That is really what we see outside of this map. Most of the others, all the states in white are states where there's pretty much one utility provider per jurisdiction. And the challenge has become, what does retail choice mean? Now, some of the states that went to retail choice that have produced bad results, I would say, did not put consumer first. They did not look to whether or not to see if junk plans were happening. So when you think about buying your internet, sometimes they say it's $29.99 and then the fine print says this is a promotional for 2 months, and after that your bill will go to $70. That happened in a lot of places with retail choice in the electric market where those provisions weren't up front. I think, and I can only speak for myself, if I do vote to go to retail choice, those will be some of the first provisions that I have to have before I agree to it. But it's very common, but I think that's the challenge now with it, as we talked about with growing technology. As I mentioned, an investor-owned utility, the only way they make money is in capital investments. And so as we talk about solar and wind, what happens when they are not owning that? It becomes, so the question that I ended with, who has the power? It's also who has the power to build power. Is really the fundamental tussle, but it's not uncommon for an investor-owned utility to be a jurisdictional here in the state of Louisiana.
No, I'm saying
Or nationally, I'm sorry, yeah. I'll go here and then I'll come here. I'll answer fast.
How do you regulate internet, cable, and cell phone service?
Very good question. So this is the tussle that I think most people do. We do not regulate broadband. However, we regulate the old broadband and communication lines. So the lines that distribute to your homes are part of our regulation, but the actual internet, our broadband access, is not part of the regulation. So we approve whether lines can go, but I cannot force AT&T or Cox to put internet or broadband in certain different territories. So it's an old relationship based off of old landlines that now those lines are being used to promote fiber and broadband to services to people.
Which is a great segue into my question. Hanging telephone wires, power lines on a pole versus burying it. When you bury it, it's typically 7 times more expensive than putting it up on the pole, but yet you wind up replacing it 5, 6, 7, 8 times compared to what is buried. So, as a commissioner, where are you? Would you rather have these companies spend more money and bury it and leave it in the ground and the power doesn't go out every time the wind gets to 20 miles an hour? Or are you okay with them replacing wire over and over and over because trees keep falling?
Right. I mean, I think that's a great question, and we are tackling this in what we call the resiliency docket at the commission. I'm going to use Florida, for example. Florida Power Lights made significant investments in moving from wooden poles to steel poles, burying their lines underground. And as you saw on that first slide, Hurricane Ian that hit them last year was a Category 5. Florida lost no transmission lines in Hurricane Ian. And so when we talk about this goes back to the compact of what is prudent. And so I am coming to the commission with a different definition of what is prudent expenses. If I know a wooden pole is not as strong and does not produce the security for a resilient system as it should be, I don't believe when you come back for rate recovery that you should get full cost, because that was a choice that you made. If you have a pole that should have been replaced 15 years ago, I think we should treat it like a car dealership. You're trading in that pole, I give you the cost of the trade-in. But as it stands right now, I give you the cost of a new line, of a new pole. And so it is a constant ever capital gains that I think goes to our detriment. And so I know people say it is costly, and it is, but the question is, after each storm, why should we continue to do the exact same thing rather than starting the transition? And I think that is the question that we face. Will the commission as a whole decide at a certain point to build a resilient system, we must make transition rather than constantly approving the same policies of a wooden pole and wires above ground? And you can see this. We have made choices. If you go downtown New Orleans, we've buried the lines underground because it was economically viable that the CBD kept power. Why are we not taking that same approach to our residential homes is a question that I've been asking a lot.
As a follow-up to that, I live in a neighborhood not far from LSU where the lines went down at 65 miles an hour, which is a regular occurrence for us. And one of the issues that came up was we're a prime target for people to come into the neighborhood. And this last time, shots were fired at a man walking his dog during the daytime. There are no cameras working, so we don't know who or what it was. So from the standpoint of the commission, is there any interaction between the safety issues in these neighborhoods?
I think that's a great point, and I think this is why I've been so active in trying to change the Public Service Commission to be actually a commission that serves the public. Because the way the commission as utility worked is we hear from the utility company talks to our staff tells the commissioners, and we either approve it or deny it. That model, I don't think, works. There has to be a pushback of we hear from people like you of issues that are coming for us to have our staff ask the utilities and for the utilities to answer. And so I'm recently, in a few weeks, we're going to call that we start having public hearings outside of our business meetings, because the only way you can ever share that voice is if there is something particular on the agenda that you can come before the commission and talk about, rather than us having a process of saying, we need to hear what our regulations is failing to do.
But as a follow-up, the first thing when this happened, this happens to us regularly. So we bought a generator, so we had power. But it goes back to this point of not putting the lines underground, or what kind of collaboration is going on with the safety side of these neighborhoods and the commission and the utility company.
Absolutely, and we've been having those questions. I see my friend Whitney over here. We've been talking about street lights downtown and trying to figure that out. And so I think the commission has to do a better job of looking at the ramifications, but I think that's why I challenge the regulatory compact so much, because it needs to take into account items of what you're talking about and not just rather the capital investments that a utility company has made. I saw a hand right here.
What happened in Texas a couple of years ago when they had their energy meltdown, because they have a different kind of energy there.
Right. So what happened with Texas, ironically, is some people would argue that this was because Texas had retail choice. But when you actually do the service, Texas had a bunch of natural gas generation, and the gas froze. And so the gas could not flow through the transmission to get to anyone's houses. And then because they had not protected their consumers, you had a bunch of junk plans. So you had people who were paying whatever the rate of energy was at that moment. So when there became a significant demand, that rises the price because now the trading stocks, and so the energy traders are now all fighting. So if you are paying, as the gritty plan, as it's called in Texas, per whatever the market is saying, that means your bill may have gone from $16 per kilowatt to $457 per kilowatt because that was the market-given price. And so Texas is a unique system of their over-reliance, I think, on natural gas, their lack of consumer protection and retail choice, and the challenges of not having virtual power plants because all of the transmission was through pipes of natural gas that significantly froze, so the generators could not work. So one more, I could squeeze it in real quick.
Okay, you talk about batteries and stuff, and you need lithium for the batteries. And I've seen that it takes, like, you have to dig up 500,000 pounds of dirt to get enough lithium for one car battery. In the whole scheme of what you've talked about, do you try to take something like that into account when you evaluate one system versus another?
I mean, I think that is the regulatory risk of a regulator. How do you balance multiple things, whether you're balancing the utilities cost and consumers cost, but also valuing promoting a cleaner environment, but at the same time, that promotion of a cleaner environment could destroy an environment elsewhere. And so it is a part of the equation to say, that's why I keep saying there's not a one-size-fit-all and ultimate solution, because it ultimately means, where do we put the risk? And I think that's the question that any commissioner would tell you that we answer on every issue is, where do we put the risk?